Before we begin, a content warning. This presentation is about the online experiences of trans people with eating disorders. We discuss eating disorders, related content and practices, and gender dysphoria. View with caution. CSCW has long been interested in how online spaces impact users with eating disorders, from examining the types of eating disorder content that people engage with, to cataloging and combating the harms that overzealous moderation systems can impose around this kind of content. Most work on eating disorders in the CSCW space depicts people with eating disorders who participate online as a homogeneous population, and focuses primarily on the experiences of cisgender women. However, eating disorders can impact anyone, regardless of gender, and regardless of if a person is cisgender or transgender. To better account for the ways gender shapes engagement with online eating disorder content and spaces, we interviewed 14 transgender and non-binary users with eating disorders. Participants included trans men, trans women, non-binary people, trans feminine non-binary people, and transmasculine non-binary people, with a wide range of experiences with eating disorders and disordered eating practices. Participants were invited to choose their own pseudonyms. At a high level, we saw trans users engaging with eating disorder content such as thinspiration, or content that is specifically intended to inspire eating disorders, in a way that sometimes shapes how trans people understand and set transition goals. For our participants, this type of content wasn't really about promoting an eating disorder specifically, but rather about setting reference points for one's own gender presentation, and sometimes gendered body transformation. For example, Florence, a trans woman, told us that thinspiration shows her how she has room to improve her body, saying, "A lot of my eating disorder is fueled by gender dysphoria and being unhappy with my body and my appearance, and I guess I've tied the idea of being skinny to what being a beautiful woman is." Other participants, like Skeletor, who is non-binary, went further. Skeletor talked about binging on trans, female-to-male, man thinspo as a reference point, but also started to see this content and the spaces it's in as a guide to technique, saying, "I realized that I could just join eating disorder community and be extremely restrictive. I started eating less and less, and then the weight actually came off because I restricted the amount of eating to ridiculously small portions. And then I started doing things like going on to eating disorder community, looking at thinspo, and then I was like, I could look like that if I tried hard enough." Despite the guiding role we find eating disorder content can play, our participants were clear. Online eating disorder spaces regularly center cis women and therefore hold cis feminine experiences with eating disorders as a default, and cis feminine bodies as an ideal model. This leaves anyone who does not fit that ideal model of experiences in a marginal position. However, we found there were important differences in how that marginal existence plays out, based on gender, and specifically the distance between one's own gender and the assumed default of cis woman. For trans feminine people, these spaces are mixed. As Florence told us, they can make trans femmes feel like one of the girls, but that only goes so far. The femininity is something trans femmes relate to, but there is still an absence of content that specifically speaks to the trans in trans feminine. As another participant, Rose, told us, this often stems from a strict focus on one hyper-specific type of cis feminine body. I think that I get really frustrated when 90% of the content I see is one body type, when I'm actively trying to be in recovery. And I think that really affects, someone who's trans, who has a not out of reach body shape for a woman. And so that constant bombardment definitely reinforces a lot of gender dysphoria, which in turn reinforces a lot of the disordered eating. While trans femmes aren't completely distant from the assumed cis femme identity, Rose's story shows us how even the distance on one dimension, transness, can prompt gender dysphoria and disordered eating. For non-binary and transmasculine people, there's even more distance from the default, with distance between both cis and trans identity and distance between femme and masc identities. That additional distance creates room for serious threats to their own sense of identity, as Eli, a transmasculine non-binary participant, recounted. You see different posts that people make and they say, "Do you ladies relate?" or just things like that. And it can feel very like, oh, okay, if I have an eating disorder, I must be a woman. Here's another thing you have in common with women, In fact, this goes beyond threats to one's sense of identity, and can even impact if one thinks their eating disorder is legitimate or not, as Draken, a trans man, explained. I would always think that I shouldn't have an eating disorder because I'm a man. Men don't have eating disorders and stuff like that. If I have bulimia, then obviously I can't be a man, or a real man wouldn't have this type of eating disorder. So maybe my eating disorder isn't real, or that I'm just I don't know. Regardless of one's distance from the cis-feminine norm, trans users still need to navigate these online eating disorder spaces, despite the fact that this requires additional adaptation labor. One common strategy is manually curating one's own online networks, so at least one feed provides the intersection of trans and eating disorder content most of our participants are looking for. However, there are issues with this strategy. The tool used, usually search, sometimes has its own limitations, as River, a non-binary participant, explained. When I'd search for accounts to follow in the anorexia recovery tag, or like the eating disorder recovery tag, it's usually all cisgendered women. But then the non-binary tag, you have to search through a bunch of just posts about being non-binary. That's not necessarily eating disorder related. Another common strategy is identity faceting, where one intentionally focuses on interpreting and relating with content through the lens of a specific facet of one's identity, as Taylor, a non-binary participant, explained. I have to cultivate a certain relationship with things that I see, where it's like this is talking about female bodies, but also women. So I see the female body part and have to purposely kind of carve myself out of the woman part of that. Taylor essentially mentally carves out and disregards the part of the content that would potentially induce dysphoric feelings, making the cis-woman-focused content more useful and bearable. Our findings point to 3 immediate design implications to better support gender minorities in online eating disorder spaces and in other online spaces where gender makes a big difference. First, we advocate specifically designing for life transitions in online eating disorder spaces. Considering our finding that eating disorder content can act as reference points for one's own gender presentation and transition, we suggest adding content into such users' feeds that provides trans-specific resources around body dysmorphia, disordered eating, and gender dysphoria, in addition to the general resources that some platforms currently provide. Moreover, we suggest that trans-specific recovery content be added to such users' feeds, including content that specifically accounts for life transitions around gender. As for trans people, this content isn't just about disordered eating. Second, we advocate designing for online curation that takes identity into account and directly reflects and reports the identity faceting strategies our participants employ. Consider a system that uses simple tools such as upvote and downvote functionalities to rank a user's individual view of an online eating disorder space, allowing trans users to, over time, communicate to the system that they prioritize posts and comments which engage transness and do not want to see posts that are too heavy on certain aspects of identity that might cause harm through dysphoria or other means. Finally, we advocate designing for search. One of the biggest problems our participants discussed was the challenge of finding groups, communities, and networks that are relevant for their specific identity. Consuming both trans content and eating disorder content isn't enough when what users need is content that integrates gender and their eating disorder. We suggest that platforms invest in leveraging and functionality in more searches, especially hashtag searches, to reflect the reality that many marginalized users hold multiple relevant identities, and truly serving such users means serving their integrated identities, not only disparate facets. Using gender as an analytic lens, we have illustrated how the entanglement of eating disorders and gender unfolds in online spaces, shaping the ways people experience and interact with online eating disorder spaces. There's more detail in the paper, including dynamics in trans-specific eating disorder spaces and reflections on eating disorder spaces as social transition machinery.